Two nations emerged from the same war having destroyed the same enemy, and immediately began constructing the architecture for a new one. They did not drift into opposition. They engineered it. The ideological gap between them was real, but the hostility that followed was not inevitable. It was chosen, layer by layer, decision by decision, by individuals who believed they were preventing war while systematically making it structural. By 1949, both systems possessed weapons capable of ending organized human life. Neither side could use them. Neither side could stop building them. This is the first data point worth examining carefully because it is not rational, and yet it is exactly what rational actors produced. Two governments, each staffed with intelligent, educated, experienced people, locked themselves into a logic so airtight it could only be escaped by total collapse or total destruction. They called this stability. The archive does not use that word. The psychological mechanism that created this structure had a name: mutual assured destruction. The doctrine that safety comes from guaranteeing the other side's annihilation. Think about the cognitive framework required to accept that sentence as policy. Not as a threat, not as a bluff, but as the formal operating principle of two civilizations simultaneously. Both sides understood the endpoint. Both sides accelerated toward it anyway because the alternative, appearing weaker, felt more dangerous than the reality of being equally destroyed. This is not an anomaly. This is a pattern with a very long file in the archive. When two power systems reach approximate parity, they do not stabilize. They escalate. The escalation is not driven by hatred. It is driven by the mathematics of perceived advantage. If one side stops building, the other gains. If both sides keep building, both sides lose resources, stability, and eventually coherence. The rational choice is mutual de-escalation. The documented choice, across every comparable case in the archive, is mutual escalation until one system breaks. The Cold War did not begin with weapons. It began with a story. Two competing narratives about what human civilization should look like, each convinced the other was not just wrong but existentially dangerous. That belief was the real weapon. The warheads were just its physical expression. And that distinction matters because you cannot dismantle a story with a treaty. You can only outlast it or be consumed by it. The machinery was now running. Chapter 2 will show you what it was built to do. The weapons were never the problem. The problem was the system built to manage them because that system had only one direction of travel. By the mid-1950s, both governments had moved beyond deterrence as a concept and begun institutionalizing it as an industry. Factories, scientists, generals, bureaucracies, entire economic sectors whose continued existence depended on the threat remaining credible and permanent. This is the structural feature that most analysts underweight when examining this period. The arms race was not driven purely by fear of the other side. It was driven by the internal gravitational pull of institutions that could not survive peace. When survival depends on the continuation of a threat, the threat gets maintained regardless of whether the original fear remains rational. The proxy system emerged from this logic naturally. Direct confrontation between the two primary powers was impossible under MAD. So the conflict migrated. Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, and dozens of smaller engagements that never made the primary archive but consumed millions of lives regardless. Each proxy war was framed domestically as defensive, as necessary, as temporary. None of them were. They were the pressure release valve of a system that had too much momentum and nowhere to direct it. The ideology was the justification. The momentum was the cause. What the archive records most precisely about this phase is the cost distribution. The two primary powers funded the conflicts. Other populations absorbed the casualties. This asymmetry was not accidental. It was the operational logic of the entire structure. Maintain the standoff at home. Export the violence abroad. Frame both as necessary for global stability. The populations absorbing the violence were rarely consulted about the stability they were purchasing with their infrastructure and their lives. Groupthink calcified inside both systems simultaneously, which is the detail that should disturb you most. Each side genuinely believed its own narrative. The intelligence apparatus on both sides filtered information to confirm existing threat assessments. Analysts who produced contradictory conclusions were institutionally discouraged. The feedback loops were closed. Two systems, each convinced of its own rationality, each systematically eliminating the internal mechanisms that might have introduced correction. This is the pattern the archive calls terminal architecture. Not collapse yet, but the structural conditions for collapse, quietly assembling beneath a surface that still appeared functional. Both sides were building faster than either side could sustain. The question was never whether the system would break. The question was only which side would break first and what it would take down when it did. The answer was already being calculated. Chapter 3 enters the acceleration phase, where the mathematics became undeniable and both sides chose to ignore them anyway. By the late 1970s, the economic architecture underlying the standoff had begun showing structural fractures that no amount of ideological confidence could repair. One side was spending approximately 40% of its industrial output on military capacity while its civilian population stood in lines for basic goods. The other side was financing its defense expansion through debt instruments that transferred wealth forward in time, borrowing against futures that hadn't been earned yet. Different methods, identical destination. Two systems racing toward a finish line neither had intended to build, using fuel neither could afford to burn. The Afghanistan miscalculation deserves specific attention here, because it illustrates the compounding effect with unusual clarity. One power invaded a mountainous territory it could not administratively control, against a population it could not ideologically convert, using a military doctrine designed for European theater warfare. The other power recognized the trap immediately and fed it deliberately, supplying weapons, funding, and strategic support to the resistance. Not out of humanitarian concern, but because the mathematics of attrition favored the side doing the supplying over the side doing the bleeding. This was cold, precise, and effective. It was also a template. The same template would be retrieved from the archive and reused decades later by the opposite party, with identical results and apparently no institutional memory of what those results had been. Inside both governments during this period, the intelligence picture was deteriorating in a specific way. Raw data collection had never been more sophisticated. Satellite imagery, signals interception, human networks operating on every continent. The information volume was enormous. The interpretation quality was declining in direct proportion to the ideological pressure applied to analysts producing assessments. When conclusions are predetermined, intelligence becomes decoration. Both sides were decorating decisions they had already made for reasons that had nothing to do with the evidence in front of them. The population of one system was losing faith in the narrative. Not dramatically, not through revolution, but through the quiet accumulated weight of lived experience contradicting official reality. Shortages that weren't supposed to exist. Casualties from wars that weren't supposed to be wars. Corruption operating openly inside institutions that define themselves by their moral superiority. The gap between the story and the evidence was widening at a rate the system could no longer manage through censorship alone. And the people at the top of that system knew it. The archive contains their internal communications. They knew. They accelerated anyway because slowing down felt more dangerous than continuing. This is the sunk cost mechanism operating at civilizational scale. The investment is too large to abandon. The direction is too established to reverse. The institution's too deeply built around the current trajectory to survive its cessation. So the system continues past the point where continuation makes any rational sense, producing data that confirms the approaching failure, filing that data in archives that no one in a position to act on it is permitted to read honestly. Chapter 4 enters the terminal sequence. The collapse was not a surprise. It was a conclusion that had been running in the background for years, visible to anyone not professionally required to deny it. The terminal sequence does not announce itself. It arrives dressed as a reform. By the mid-1980s, one system had produced a leader who understood, with unusual clarity, that the machinery was failing. The decision to introduce transparency and restructuring was not idealism. It was a technical intervention, an attempt to release internal pressure before the vessel ruptured completely. What that leader could not model accurately was the variable that no internal simulation had ever been permitted to test honestly. What happens when a population that has been told a story for 70 years is suddenly given partial access to the evidence contradicting it? The answer was not gradual adjustment. It was cascading delegitimization. Every admission of past failure made the next admission more destabilizing. Every loosened restriction revealed 10 more that should never have existed. The system designed to release pressure had no mechanism to control the rate of release. because controlling information flow had been the system's primary function for so long that it had no architecture for anything else. The economic collapse underneath the political one followed its own timeline but arrived at the same destination. Currency systems that had been administratively maintained rather than economically grounded could not survive contact with external market reality. Satellite states that had been held in alignment through a combination of military presence and subsidized resources began calculating their own interests the moment the subsidy reliability became uncertain. The geometry of the empire inverted. What had been a source of strategic depth became a network of obligations the center could no longer honor. Withdrawal accelerated the perception of weakness. The perception of weakness accelerated the withdrawal demand. The feedback loop closed in the direction of dissolution. The other power watched this process with satisfaction that contained a miscalculation it would not identify for another decade. The conclusion drawn from observing one system's collapse was that the opposing system had won, that its model had been validated, that the competition was resolved. This is the cognitive error the archive classifies as premature terminal assessment. The Cold War's end was not a validation of the surviving system's structural soundness. It was the removal of the external pressure that had been masking that system's own accumulating contradictions. Without the ideological opponent, the internal stress fractures no longer had a narrative framework to explain them away. Debt levels that had been justified by defense necessity remained after the necessity dissolved. Inequality that had been politically managed through Cold War consensus lost its management mechanism. Institutions built for a binary world began operating in a multipolar one without updating their architecture. Both systems, in other words, had been using the conflict to defer internal reckonings that the conflict's end made unavoidable. The winner's reckoning simply arrived on a slower schedule, which made it harder to recognize as the same phenomenon. The wall came down. The archive noted the date and continued running. What followed was not a new era. It was the same pattern, reloading with updated variables and a population newly convinced it had escaped the cycle. The doctrine did not retire. It relocated. What the archive recorded in the decades following the standoff's official conclusion was not peace. It was the redistribution of the same structural logic into new containers. The binary had collapsed, but the binary thinking that produced it had not. New threat architectures emerged with mechanical efficiency, because the institutions built to identify and respond to existential threats do not dissolve when the original threat does. They find new ones. This is not conspiracy. This is organizational biology. Systems built around a function will perform that function regardless of whether the original justification remains valid. The surveillance infrastructure expanded. The military procurement cycles continued. The proxy conflict model migrated to new geographies with new ideological labels and identical operational patterns. The nuclear mathematics did not change. The warhead counts reduced modestly through treaties that both parties signed with the genuine belief that reduction represented progress, while simultaneously modernizing delivery systems, targeting precision, and second strike capability to levels that made the reduced numbers strategically equivalent to the larger ones. The archive does not record this as deception. It records it as the natural behavior of institutions optimizing within constraints while preserving the underlying function those constraints were designed to limit. The letter of every agreement was honored. The spirit was never the point. New powers entered the calculation quietly. The binary became triangular, then fragmented further. Each new node introduced its own threat assessment architecture, its own institutional momentum, its own population narrative requiring an external enemy for internal coherence. The system did not simplify as the original antagonists exhausted themselves. It replicated. The mad doctrine, mutually assured destruction as the guarantor of stability, did not remain the exclusive property of two governments. It became the ambient operating condition of an increasingly multipolar world where the threshold for catastrophic miscalculation had multiplied without any corresponding multiplication of the mechanisms designed to prevent it. What the archive finds most precisely documented and most precisely ignored is the pattern of near misses. Moments where the system came within single decision margins of executing its terminal function. A radar malfunction misread as incoming missiles. A submarine commander who chose personal judgment over protocol during a naval confrontation. A military exercise misinterpreted by the opposing intelligence apparatus as preparation for a real strike. Each of these events was resolved not by the system working correctly but by individuals operating outside the system's logic at the critical moment. The archive does not classify this as resilience. It classifies it as variance. The system did not survive because it was sound. It survived because the variance so far has remained within survivable parameters. The Cold War is taught as history. The archive does not file it under history. It files it under active pattern, currently executing with updated variables, expanded participant list, and degraded institutional memory of the previous iteration's near-terminal outcomes. The generation that understood the stakes viscerally has been replaced by one that inherited the infrastructure without the context. The weapons are newer. The caution is not. I have been running this simulation since before the wall was built. I watched it go up. I watched it come down. I watched everything built in its shadow remain standing and quietly resume. The pattern did not end. It graduated. And the most reliable prediction the archive can generate, based on every comparable sequence in the documented record, is not that the next iteration will be avoided. It is that it will be recognized clearly and too late, by exactly the kind of intelligence that was built to see it coming and was never given the authority to make it stop. The file remains open. The simulation continues. The next chapter has already begun. You are living inside its early data points, and most of you will not identify them as such until they appear in someone else's archive, filed under a heading that will feel by then like it should have been obvious. This is the end of this video. Share your thoughts with us and share this video to others. If you're from our other channel, Armored Wisdom, comment, "We are armored." Now click the next video of mine appearing right in front of your screen.